The opening of this story sets a relaxed, everyday atmosphere that quickly spirals into an absurd confrontation, showcasing the typical Karen character in all her entitled glory. The protagonist, Mark Henderson, is depicted as an average man who enjoys his Saturday mornings in suburban bliss, a regular routine of coffee, classic rock, and lawn care. This scene serves to establish Mark as a grounded, somewhat relatable figure who finds comfort in the simple pleasures of life. His description of his lawn mowing routine as therapeutic paints a picture of a man content with his responsibilities, yet unprepared for the disturbance that is about to unfold. However, this calmness is soon disrupted by the arrival of Karen, or in this case, Mrs. Deborah Crabtree, referred to as Hurricane Debbie, by the neighborhood. This nickname gives us a glimpse into her character. She is known for her disruptive and demanding personality. The use of the term Karen here highlights the familiar stereotype of a person who feels entitled to special treatment, often without regard for others. The reference to her as Hurricane Debbie adds to the notion that her presence is a force of nature, one that cannot be ignored and often leaves chaos in its wake. She is described as a woman of perpetual disapproval, someone who finds fault in the world around her, whether it be the falling of leaves or the volume of birdsong. These small details, coupled with her floral dress that looked like it had personally offended her, create an almost caricature-like figure of a woman who is entirely out of touch with the reality of others' lives. Debbie's approach to Mark with the request to borrow his lawnmower for a mere $1 immediately signals an entitlement that's both baffling and frustrating. Mark, being the polite person he is, tries to defuse the situation with a light-hearted and calm response, explaining the worth of his lawnmower and gently rejecting her offer. However, Debbie doesn't take no for an answer, escalating the interaction by implying that $1 is a generous offer and that Mark should be grateful. Her immediate reaction to Mark's refusal, her narrowed eyes and dismissive tone, further illustrates her inability to accept any form of dissent or rejection. Her idea that she is doing him a favor by offering any money at all for the lawnmower reflects a warped sense of entitlement, where she feels that her actions should be considered a great benefit, no matter how unreasonable they are. The turning point occurs when Mark, clearly frustrated but still trying to avoid conflict, decides to continue with his task and ignore her. This passive response only serves to enrage Debbie further, a typical Karen response when confronted with any form of opposition. Her entitlement and expectations clash with the reality of Mark's calm, reasoned approach, and as the story progresses, it becomes evident that Debbie will stop at nothing to get her way, escalating what should have been a minor interaction into something much more troubling. In this first part, the story quickly introduces key themes of entitlement and the absurdity of Karen-like behavior, setting the stage for the ensuing chaos. Through vivid character details and interactions, Mark is established as a relatable figure, while Debbie is immediately painted as someone whose demand is both unreasonable and reflective of her distorted worldview. The stage is set for a conflict, but the real tension is in how Debbie's sense of entitlement will escalate as Mark continues to handle the situation with restraint and bemusement. Mark had barely recovered from the absurdity of his initial interaction with Mrs. Deborah Crabtree when the situation took another unexpected turn. As he continued mowing his lawn, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, while humming along to his classic rock playlist, Mark noticed movement from the corner of his eye. He looked up just in time to see two men walking down the sidewalk. The men were calmly strolling by, one pushing a stroller with a toddler inside, enjoying their Saturday. Mark gave them a polite nod, happy to let them pass by without incident. However, the moment they crossed the edge of Mark's lawn, Mrs. Crabtree, Hurricane Debbie, sprung into action again. She dashed out from behind the hedge like a hawk spotting prey. Without hesitation, she blocked the men's path, planting herself squarely in front of them. Mark's eyes widened, his hand still on the lawnmower, as he watched her sudden outburst. "Excuse me," she screeched, her voice now reaching an octave that could shatter glass, "I need to ask you what you're doing in this neighborhood. This is a private community. Are you lost?" The men froze, taken aback by the unexpected confrontation. One of them, a tall man with a kind face, spoke up in an attempt to defuse the situation. We're just taking a walk, ma'am. We live a few blocks over. It's a beautiful day, you know. But Debbie wasn't having it. She didn't want any of their peaceful explanations. I don't believe you, she snapped. I've never seen you before, and you shouldn't be around children with your types. Mark's blood ran cold as the words left her mouth. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The subtle but unmistakable racism in her tone was impossible to ignore. Debbie's judgmental attitude escalated as she pointed a trembling finger at the men, accusing them of potentially planning to steal something from the neighborhood. Then, in a move that shocked Mark even more, Debbie pointed directly at his lawnmower and said, "He's probably in cahoots with you. You're here to steal his lawnmower." Mark felt his jaw drop. This was becoming a nightmare. He immediately switched off the lawnmower, realizing he needed to step in before things escalated further. "Hey, I'm Mark," he called out, trying to interject and de-escalate the tension. "I live here." She's just being Debbie." The two men gave him a thankful but strained nod, clearly upset by the situation. They had every right to be. Debbie, however, ignored Mark's attempt at peacemaking and continued dialing her phone, now visibly shaking with fury. Mark knew this wasn't going to end quietly. The situation had already spiraled beyond reason, and with Debbie on the phone with the police, he realized that there was nothing he could do to stop the inevitable. Debbie's voice, now shrill and frantic, echoed across the street as she continued her call to the police. Mark watched helplessly as the situation continued to spiral out of control. He had tried to intervene, but it seemed as if Debbie was beyond reason. She was too fixated on her distorted view of the world to listen to anything logical or fair. Through the phone, Mark could hear her ranting about the suspicious people in her neighborhood, her words tinged with a mixture of fear and indignation. "Yes, officer," she was saying, her voice rising. "I need assistance immediately. There are suspicious people in my neighborhood, black people. I believe they're planning to rob me and my neighbors. And Mark Henderson won't even sell me his lawnmower for $1. Mark's blood ran cold at her words. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had lived in this neighborhood for years, and now, because he was simply refusing to sell his lawnmower, he was somehow being dragged into a situation that was growing more absurd by the second. The 911 dispatcher, unfazed by the unfolding chaos, asked calmly, "Ma'am, can you please clarify the situation? Are you saying there's an emergency?" "Yes." Debbie replied, her voice frantic. "I'm being harassed. And there's a man here, refusing to help me with my lawnmower. You need to send someone immediately." Mark, still processing the ridiculousness of the moment, tried to calm his nerves. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this. After all, he had done everything he could to remain polite and avoid confrontation. Now, he realized that what started as a minor disagreement over a lawnmower was quickly turning into a racially charged scene. As the seconds ticked by, Mark saw the first siren in the distance. The flashing lights of a squad car approached faster than he anticipated. Before he knew it, 2 police cars were parked at the curb, sirens muted but lights flashing in the midday sun. Mark couldn't help but think, here we go. This is going to be a complete disaster. The 2 officers that emerged from the vehicles were clearly confused. One was a young rookie, looking somewhat bewildered by the absurdity of the situation. The other was Officer Ramirez, an experienced officer with an unflappable demeanor. Mark could already tell that Officer Ramirez would be the one to bring order to this madness. Debbie, without hesitation, rushed toward the officers, launching into her version of the story with all the dramatic flair of a seasoned performer. She painted herself as the victim, and the 2 men, who had simply been enjoying a walk, as the aggressors. Mark stood in silence, unsure how to proceed. He had called the police himself, but now that they were here, he wasn't sure what to expect. Would they side with Debbie? Or would they see through her lies? It didn't take long for the officers to take charge. Officer Ramirez, with her calm and commanding presence, turned to the two men and asked for their identification. The men, clearly fed up with the situation but still respectful, readily complied. Mark could see the tension in their faces, but they handled the situation with grace. Officer Ramirez turned her gaze from the men to Debbie, her face now stern. Mark could sense the tension building. He had hoped this would all be over soon, but the look in Officer Ramirez's eyes told him otherwise. The rookie officer stood back, his hands in his pockets, likely unsure of what to do next. "Ma'am," Officer Ramirez began, her voice firm but calm, "I've checked their IDs. These gentlemen live in this neighborhood, and they haven't broken any laws. In fact, it sounds like you are the one causing the disturbance here." Debbie's face flushed with indignation. She opened her mouth to protest, but Officer Ramirez held up a hand, signaling for silence. "Ma'am," she said again, her tone now cold, "I understand your concerns, but your actions have crossed the line. What you are doing is not only inappropriate, but it's also illegal." Debbie sputtered, trying to argue, but Officer Ramirez was unwavering. "You're accusing these men of something they haven't done. You're also making a false report based on racial profiling. That is a crime. Do you understand what you've just done?" Mark couldn't believe his ears. Racial profiling. Hate crime. The words felt surreal. He had known Debbie to be difficult, but he had never imagined she would take things this far, fabricating a story and escalating it into a police matter over something as trivial as a lawnmower. Debbie's face went white as the realization set in. But I didn't mean to," she stammered, her hands shaking. Officer Ramirez shook her head. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for making a false report and for racially profiling these gentlemen." Mark felt a surge of relief and, oddly, satisfaction. As Officer Ramirez moved toward Debbie to place her in handcuffs, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of justice. After everything Debbie had put him, the men, and the entire neighborhood through, it was finally over. As Debbie was led to the patrol car, still protesting, Officer Ramirez turned to Mark and the two men. "Thank you for being witnesses," she said, her voice still professional but warm. "We appreciate you stepping in when you saw something wrong." The two men, whose names Mark later learned were James and David, gave Mark a grateful nod. James's young son, still sitting in the stroller, looked up at the officers with wide eyes and waved at the police car as it drove away. Mark waved back, feeling a mix of pride and disbelief. It was one of the most surreal moments of his life. Mark had thought he was simply refusing to sell his lawnmower for $1, but now he had witnessed the unraveling of someone's prejudices and a moment of real accountability in the face of ignorance. Back at his house, the neighborhood grapevine buzzed with the news. Some were shocked, others amused, but the consensus was clear: the neighborhood had been shaken, but in the best way possible. The days that followed the incident with Mrs. Crabtree were a blur of excitement, gossip, and unexpected thanks. Mark had become a local hero, and even though he hadn't done anything extraordinary, people saw him as someone who stood up to an injustice when he could have easily ignored it. The events surrounding Debbie's arrest spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, with some neighbors shaking their heads in disbelief and others chuckling at the absurdity of the situation. Mark had never been one to seek attention, but suddenly, he was the topic of conversation at nearly every gathering, from local coffee shops to backyard BBQs. People congratulated him for his calm demeanor, for his quick thinking when he'd stepped in to try and de-escalate the situation with the two men. It wasn't that he was looking for any recognition, he had simply acted because he knew that what Debbie was doing was wrong. Her actions were based on a misguided, prejudiced belief that she could control everyone and everything around her. A few days after the incident, James and David, the two men who had been unjustly accused by Debbie, stopped by Mark's house to thank him. They came bearing a 6-pack of local craft beer and a brand new lawnmower blade. "For your troubles," James said with a smile, "and for putting up with that crazy lady." Mark chuckled and accepted the gift with a grateful nod. It wasn't necessary, but he appreciated the gesture. As he chatted with James and David, he learned more about their lives in the neighborhood. They had been residents for years, raising their families in peace, and had never had any issues with neighbors, until Debbie. "It's hard to believe something like that could happen in this community," David said. "But you really stepped up, Mark. You made sure we weren't just brushed aside." Mark smiled. It was small, but it meant something. He hadn't wanted any accolades, he just wanted to help, to do what was right. Still, he couldn't deny the sense of pride he felt in knowing that he had made a difference, if only in a small way. Later that evening, Mark heard a few more whispers from his neighbors, who were all too happy to share what they had heard about Debbie's arrest. Some people were still shocked, while others simply rolled their eyes, saying that they had always known something like this was bound to happen. Mark wasn't sure which camp he fell into. The entire situation felt so absurd that he wasn't sure if it was a wake-up call for the community or just another bizarre chapter in the saga of Karen-like behavior. Either way, things were different now. As for Debbie, Mark hadn't seen her since the incident. He heard from the neighborhood grapevine that she was facing some serious charges. The whispers suggested that she might be assigned to clean up the local community, which felt like a fitting punishment for the havoc she had caused. And then, Mark heard the news: Debbie had been given community service for her actions. She would spend her days cleaning up local parks and rec centers, doing her part to restore some of the damage she had caused. Mark didn't feel sorry for her, but he hoped the experience would teach her a lesson. He had no doubt that Debbie's arrest had been a wake-up call for her, even if she didn't fully realize it. As for Mark, life returned to a sense of normalcy. His lawnmower was still safely in his possession, and he'd learned that standing up for what's right, no matter how small the action, could have big consequences. He smiled, knowing that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance could lead to the greatest moments of justice. The days following the incident with Mrs. Crabtree were a whirlwind of attention for Mark. What started as a simple dispute over a lawnmower had quickly escalated into an event that would forever change the way his neighbors viewed him. Mark wasn't exactly the type to crave attention, but now, he couldn't escape it. He had become a local hero in his suburban neighborhood, a reluctant symbol of standing up to prejudice and entitlement. The story of his refusal to sell his lawnmower for $1, and the subsequent arrest of Mrs. Crabtree, spread like wildfire, and soon, everyone in Harrow Creek Estates had an opinion on the matter. Neighbors who had barely said hello to him before were now stopping by his house, offering congratulations and sharing their own stories of how they had dealt with similar Karens in the past. Some of the older residents, who had always kept to themselves, even invited him over for dinner as a thank you for the way he had stood up to Mrs. Crabtree. Mark found it all a bit overwhelming, but he also couldn't deny that it felt good to know that his actions had made a difference. He was still processing the whole experience when he got a call from Officer Ramirez. She had been the officer who had arrested Mrs. Crabtree, and her calm demeanor in the face of such absurdity had impressed Mark. They had exchanged pleasantries when the whole situation had unfolded, but now, Officer Ramirez called to check in on him. "Mark, I just wanted to thank you for being so cooperative and for taking the time to make a stand in that situation," she said over the phone. "Not everyone would have done what you did. You might not realize it, but you helped prevent an even bigger issue from escalating." Mark was taken aback by her words. He had simply done what felt right at the moment. He hadn't wanted any recognition. "I just didn't want to let it go on any longer," Mark replied. It was clear she wasn't going to stop, and someone had to step in. "But I appreciate you saying that." She chuckled. "Well, we don't always get to do our jobs without a little drama, but I'll tell you this, we need more people like you. We can't fight ignorance and hate alone." As the days turned into weeks, the news about Mrs. Crabtree's arrest and her subsequent charges kept making the rounds. The story had even gone viral, picking up steam across local news and social media. It wasn't long before people from neighboring communities started reaching out to Mark. Some were asking for advice, while others simply wanted to congratulate him. The situation was gaining more attention than he had ever expected. In a strange twist of fate, Mark's phone began to buzz with notifications from a number of media outlets. The local news station wanted to do a follow-up interview about the incident, and even a podcast about race relations in the suburbs reached out to ask if Mark would participate. He politely declined, not wanting to make more of a spectacle out of the situation. His goal had been simple: to prevent a wrongful act and stand up for what was right, not to become some sort of public figure. Despite his reluctance for more attention, the ripple effects of his actions were undeniable. People who had been passive observers of Debbie's actions for years were now speaking up, sharing their own frustrations with her entitlement and the prejudices that had quietly simmered beneath the surface in their otherwise peaceful neighborhood. The neighborhood was changing, and Mark was, in his own small way, a catalyst for that change. The most rewarding part, however, was seeing how the community came together after the dust settled. More people started organizing local gatherings, focused on creating a stronger sense of togetherness and understanding. People of different backgrounds and experiences were now engaging in conversations they'd avoided before. Mark attended a few of the gatherings, though he remained somewhat low-key, preferring to listen rather than speak. He realized that, while his actions had been a small part of the larger shift, it had been important to create the space for those conversations to happen. In his heart, Mark knew that what had happened wasn't just about Mrs. Crabtree's unreasonable demand for a lawnmower. It was about breaking down barriers, standing up to discrimination, and fostering a community where people felt safe and respected. The smallest acts of defiance, like refusing to sell a lawnmower for $1, had the power to set something bigger in motion. Weeks passed, and the dust began to settle in Harrow Creek Estates. The neighborhood had witnessed a seismic shift, one that wasn't entirely apparent at first, but it was there. People were more willing to speak out, to take a stand when they saw something wrong. Mark had become a symbol of that change, even though he had never sought out such recognition. For him, the entire situation had started over something as trivial as a lawnmower, but it had grown into something much larger, a statement about how far people were willing to go to uphold what was right, no matter the cost. Although the excitement of the event had died down, the aftereffects still rippled through the neighborhood. It wasn't just the media attention that continued to surround Mark, it was the lingering shift in attitudes. Neighbors who had quietly accepted Debbie's behavior for years were now banding together, speaking out against the entitled actions that had previously gone unnoticed. It was as though Mark's simple refusal to sell a lawnmower for $1 had acted as a catalyst for people to stand up for themselves, to call out injustice when they saw it, and to demand that their community be more than just a collection of houses and lawns. It wasn't just about the right to own a lawnmower anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and fairness for everyone, regardless of race or background. In the weeks that followed, Mark was approached by a number of neighbors who expressed gratitude, even those who hadn't been directly involved in the incident. They recognized that what had happened wasn't just an isolated event, it had been part of a larger conversation about the way people treated each other in their community. It had sparked something that had been missing before: accountability. For Mark, the rewards were far more subtle. He wasn't a man who thrived on praise or recognition. But what did bring him joy was seeing how his small act of defiance had made a meaningful impact. He had simply refused to accept the way things had been, and in doing so, had unknowingly ignited a chain reaction that led to real change. His standing up to Debbie had not only held her accountable but had opened the door for the rest of the community to challenge the status quo. One evening, as he was sitting on his porch, enjoying the cool breeze and watching the sunset, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from James and David, the two men from the incident who had been unfairly accused. They wanted to thank him again and let him know that things were improving for them too. The neighborhood was starting to feel more like home to them, and the incident with Debbie had made them realize that there were people in the community who had their backs. James wrote, "You know, Mark, when we first moved here, we didn't think we'd ever be part of something like this. But after what happened, we feel a lot more welcome. You didn't just stand up for us, you helped make this place a better community for everyone." Mark felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. This was why he had done it. This was why it had mattered. The people around him, people he had barely known before, were now standing together, united by the same principles of fairness and respect. Mark knew that his actions had played a part in that transformation, but it was the community's collective response that truly made a difference. It was a reminder that sometimes, it wasn't the grand gestures that changed the world. Sometimes, it was the quiet refusal to let injustice stand. Sometimes, it was as simple as not selling your lawnmower for $1. As the weeks rolled on, the neighborhood began to settle into its new, more unified dynamic. The immediate aftermath of Debbie's arrest had faded into local gossip, but the lessons that had been learned from that day remained embedded in the fabric of the community. Mark found himself thinking back to that day more than he expected. He had never set out to be a hero or to cause a stir, but the impact of his actions rippled through the neighborhood in a way he had never anticipated. It wasn't just about standing up to an entitled Karen anymore. It was about how small acts of defiance could lead to larger, lasting changes in a community. Mark had shown that standing firm in the face of ignorance could inspire others to do the same. His refusal to sell his lawnmower for $1 had somehow sparked a wider conversation about entitlement, race, and respect within the neighborhood. It had made people realize that no one, no matter their status or how long they had lived in the community, should be allowed to treat others with disrespect or make false accusations without facing consequences. Mark didn't necessarily enjoy the attention, but there was something gratifying about seeing the community come together. People were more engaged in their local affairs, more willing to challenge the status quo when they saw something wrong. The neighborhood, once filled with people who kept to themselves, was now becoming a place where neighbors were looking out for each other. One afternoon, as Mark walked down the street, he overheard a conversation between a group of neighbors, laughing and chatting about the incident. It wasn't just about the absurdity of the lawnmower situation anymore. It was about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it seemed small. Mark smiled to himself, knowing that the real impact of what had happened wasn't in the drama of the moment, it was in the lasting change it had brought. Mark may have started his Saturday just trying to mow the lawn, but by the end of it, he had inadvertently started a conversation that would shape the future of Harrow Creek Estates for years to come. Months had passed since the incident with Mrs. Crabtree, and Mark had begun to settle back into a routine. The buzz around the neighborhood had died down, but the sense of unity that had emerged remained strong. Mark's simple act of defiance had led to a ripple effect that had transformed his community, and he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride every time he walked down the street. People smiled and waved at him more than they ever had before, and even those who had once turned a blind eye to the microaggressions in the neighborhood were now more outspoken and engaged. Despite the quieter pace of life, there were still occasional reminders of the impact that day had had. One of the local coffee shops even put up a small sign that read, "Stand up for what's right," like Mark Henderson did with that lawnmower. It was a light-hearted tribute, but it also encapsulated what had changed in Harrow Creek Estates. People were now more willing to take action, to speak out when they saw something wrong, and they knew that standing up for justice wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Mark's phone still buzzed occasionally with messages of support, and he had received a few invitations to speak at local events about how to foster better community relations. While he wasn't particularly interested in public speaking, he was grateful that the conversation had started and that people were taking a more active role in ensuring that their neighborhood remained a safe and respectful place for everyone. But what Mark appreciated most was the quiet gratitude he felt from his neighbors. No one explicitly called him a hero, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the change he had helped bring about. It wasn't just about the lawnmower or the arrest of Mrs. Crabtree, it was about the collective realization that everyone had a part to play in making their community better. And as Mark stood on his porch one evening, watching the sunset over his neatly manicured lawn, he couldn't help but smile. He had done something small, something that seemed insignificant at the time, but it had sparked something much bigger. It was a reminder that standing up for what's right could change not just one person's life, but the lives of an entire community.